Welcome to Mining the Media, providing nuggets of news and cutting-edge questions and answers, minus the political blather. Here are your hosts, G.K. Allen and Dave Jeffers.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Mining the Media. I'm Dave Jeffers, your co-host and producer. That's G.K. Allen, our creator and our co-host. And we are so happy to welcome back Ted Baehr, who's the founder and publisher of Movie Guide, the family guide to movies and entertainment. He's also chairman of the Christian Film and Television Commission Ministry, as well as a noted critic, educator, lecturer, media pundit. His life purpose is to be used of God to redeem the values of media while educating audiences on how to use discernment in selecting their entertainment. And my favorite quote of his is he's quoted as, "He who controls the media controls the culture." So Dr. Baehr, thank you again for coming on our show.
I love being on the show, and I pray for both of you. So God bless you.
Sir.
Well, I've got a question for you in these trying times. I think the last couple of weeks in particular, the world has seen some unbelievably shocking news, lots of immorality, amorality, and lying. And I think at times like this, it's important to get a good laugh now and then. Do you have any suggestions, whether it's from the silent film days or from the Marx Brothers era or contemporary, any idea, if you want to have a good laugh, what we can watch?
Well, I can give you a lot of suggestions, but it probably not off the top of my head, because we have reviewed over 14,000 films on Movie Guide. Very comprehensive. And of course, my father starred in movies from 1930s. He starred in 62 movies, and about, 1/4 of those were cowboy movies. But then another fourth were comedies, and he won the box office award. So there's just tremendous. And then I did a series for a secular network in the United States on the classic comedies, 70 classic comedies, introducing W.C. Fields and what happened to him afterwards, and Buster Keaton. Some of those guys were absolutely great. And you remember their movies like The General and others, and It Happened One Night, and all those great movies. So we can talk about it in a superficial way, but if anybody wants the details, they go to movieguide.org and look up comedies, and they will be flooded with comedies to choose. And we evaluate them by the quality, 4 stars, and also by the acceptability. So a lot of the comedies that have been doing these days are not so acceptable, even some of the Pixar, but some of the great Pixars are just wonderful, like Finding Nemo, written by Andrew Stanton, who's a good friend of ours, and he teaches a great class. I just taught a class in filmmaking, and I had a guy who taught at the class who made lots of comedies, and he always wove Bible stories in them, and he wrote the music for them with Bible stories because he's a 3rd generation pastor. So, if you're talking about an overwhelming amount of information that's not coming out of the news media in terms of the good, the true, and the beautiful, I'll give you lots of classic comedies. But I printed off a few quickly. So you've got Pink Panther. Now, a friend of mine produced the Pink Panther series. He just died a week ago. Again, he was a very close friend, and we worked together, and he had been on our board and gotten a lot of awards.
What was his name?
And so Ken Wales. And Ken Wales worked with me for many, many years. And Ken produced the Pink Panther movies. He produced the Christie movies. Blake Edwards was, of course, one of the most responsible people in Hollywood. Blake started out, and it's funny, his career in itself, although he made some missteps, he started out by taking old Warner Brothers scripts and changing the title and the character name, selling them to Warner Brothers for millions of dollars, remaking the movies. And finally, after the 3rd one, the head of development of Warner Brothers said, "Blake, these movies sound awfully familiar," because they were all Warner Brothers movies. And my father was signed with Warner Brothers. He was Ted Baehr, but they signed him up as of course, Robert Allen. Now, some of these comedies, I'm looking over this list we have on here, would be politically incorrect now. You've got Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell. Rosalind Russell starred with my father on Broadway in Auntie Mame, but His Girl Friday, and I remember a lot of it. Yeah. It would be not as positive. Singing in the Rain, of course, we know, but one of my favorites with John Wayne is just a wonderful movie. but I can't even mention it on your show because it's so politically incorrect. And if you remember The Quiet Man, he drags her across the moors of Ireland by the hair. It's very funny, but if you ever did that today, you'd have a lawsuit bigger than the one for for Harvey Weinstein. So, Hail the Conquering Hero, Sullivan's Travels. There's tons of comedies, and if you want to go to movieguide.org, you can find even more.
We'll be sure to link to that so that our listeners and viewers can find that, because that's a nice resource to have in this day and age. Because I know my pastor, he's very, very particular on what he will watch. He uses your website and a couple of other websites that rate the films, not just for appropriate and language, but is it any good? Is it worth my time to watch it? Because not every film that doesn't have profanity or explicit language is necessarily good. And so it's hard to weed through all of them. So,
Well, Ted, when you were talking about the Pink Panther films, Peter Sellers, to me, was one of the greatest actors in history. His ability to mimic the character, if you watch the very first Pink Panther, which is one of my 10 favorite films of all time, and the following Pink Panthers, the way he developed the Clouseau character and became ultra French and even Frencher and Frencher and Frencher. He was, and then you go to Dr. Strangelove or Being There. The versatility of what that man could do was amazing.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you can't fight in this room. It's the war room. Yeah, we know all of this, but you got to get back into the memory pattern that's going on here. But Peter Sellers was a great friend of Ken Wales. Ken Wales was a great producer and produced some of the best movies. Started out with Disney, and of course won the box office, or at least won television with Christie, which was wonderful. But I used some of those examples in the class I just taught. And as I said, one person had been the head of a studio who was teaching the class. It's a 5-day course on how to succeed in Hollywood. It sort of condenses the 3 years I did when I was head of the department at Berkeley, which I can't mention on a Christian show because they all think Berkeley is crazy. And the department I headed at City University of New York. But it's a wonderful tool. And one of the people who were teaching was a film financier. But there's so many good comedies. Most of the Pixar movies made before, when Ed Catmull was still head of Pixar. And back in the 1978, the Pixar people, the initial people, David DeFrancisco came to my house. We were teaching him. I was head of the department at City University of New York. Those 5 made a movie, and I showed it to the head of Paramount. It was boring. So they took until the mid-90s, and they listened, and they perfected their craft. And the first movies were just excellent. Toy Story is wonderful. Yeah. Toy Story 2 is wonderful. And Finding Nemo, as I said, is one of the funniest movies. So I use an example. If I was going to tell you, either of you, that I wanted to produce a movie and I needed your money, and it was a romantic comedy, and I had Ellen DeGeneres starring in it, what would you say? No, but Finding Nemo, she was the love interest, the angel fish.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes I can remember listening to some British actors, a number of them years ago, in a collection of interviews, Ted, and what they were basically saying as an actor, that's our profession. That's what we do. Plumbers plumb, if you will. Barbers cut hair. Talk show hosts talk. And they say, well, we have to take a role because I've got bills to pay. And sometimes I realize that I'm taking this role because I have bills to pay. And I think we have to realize that sometimes actors don't get the scripts they'd love to have and the scripts that really could bring out their talent. Sometimes they simply need to make a buck.
Well, that's true. My father starred in 62 movies, and some of the ones at the end of his life got later on. I mean, he starred on Broadway for many years. So he starred in Showboat and all of that. And he picked up a few roles that I didn't care for, although his part in those movies was very good. But I have a story about John Quaid, who was one of my close friends. and he starred in a lot of Clint Eastwood movies as the villain. He was the villain. He had been a physicist and astrophysicist at one of the great universities in the United States. Somebody said, "John, you're so good. You should go to Hollywood." He had a face for Hollywood. He was so ugly. You just looked at him and you knew that he was the villain. So John is doing all these Clint Eastwood, and Clint Eastwood's manager says, "We're casting his next movie." John says, "Let me, look at the script." He looks at the script and walks out of the office, and the guy is running after him and says, "John, what's wrong?" He says, "Well, I don't need to use bad language to be a bad guy." Well, John, we know you're a Christian, but you always play the villain. How can you play the villain if you're the Christian? He said, "As a Christian, I understand evil better than you'll ever understand it, because I understand the darkness that is in every man." But the fact of the matter is that a lot of actors that I know refuse to stoop to conquer. And because they refuse to stoop to conquer, their parts get better. And if you look at Die Hard 1, which is a great movie, the villain never uses foul language. He does use an English accent, which might be close to it, but he never uses foul language.
There's a film that I mentioned to you, I believe. I don't if we did it either on air or just chatting. I think I told you, Ted, years ago when I was a teenager, I was in Switzerland. I won't bore you with all the details, but a friend of ours was the chauffeur, if you will, for William Holden. And my friend Kurt was also a stunt pilot, and he would give me rudimentary stunt flying lessons the summers I spent over there. And I'm expecting Kurt to pick me up in Zurich, and he pulls up in his car, and William Holden's with him. And I get to meet William Holden. I was about 15 or 16. And I said to him, "Mr. Holden, I love your films. I'm curious, of all the films you've made, what role do you like the best?" I didn't ask him. I'm 15 or 16, but I guess the future critic in me was already there. I said, "What film do you like the most? What character do you like the most?" And he said a film called The Counterfeit Trader, where he plays a Swedish American businessman who has to spy on the Nazis. It's a moral film. Lily Palmer plays the religious influence in it. And it's a wonderful film. It has a religious tone to it. And I find it interesting because that's usually a film most people don't even know of when they talk about William Holden. And by the way, he couldn't have been nicer to a 15-year-old kid.
Well, I understand, but you can't talk about him in my presence. My father starred in 12 cowboy movies, and then he starred in about 12 comedies. He won the box office award for Love Me Forever in 1936 at the Roosevelt Hotel, where we hosted the Movie Guide Awards 2 years ago. But when he moved on, he was always saying, "I don't want to be typecast as a comedy. I don't want to be typecast as a cowboy," although he'd been in the cavalry in World War I. So, and he was probably one of the best. He was the first Texas Ranger, but he was one of the best because he could ride. He could ride under the horse and shoot villains, which you had to be trained to do in the cavalry in World War I. But when he moved out of his role at Columbia, they hired the guy you just named, whose name I'm not going to use in my family, to take his place. So, that's it. And then when he went off to war, the people who stayed behind and took the jobs, because Hollywood at that time was a studio system. So they used to have a stable of cowboy stars. It was about 12 people in the stable, and then a stable of comedy stars, and then a stable of this. And when you left, like Jimmy Stewart, when he left, he came back and he spent 2 years walking the streets of Hollywood, not getting a job. So my father needed a job. So he went to Broadway and he starred in Showboat at that time. And he got such rave reviews that he starred on Broadway until Whoopi 30 years later. So he never went back to Hollywood. So that's the end of his story in Hollywood. But William Holden was not one of those people who went off to war and made a difference for his country. So you don't mention his name around me.
Well, I have a question. As we get closer to the end of the interview, as a writer, I get a lot of high school grads who tell me they're interested in writing and what they should study in school. And I said, well, if you want to be should I go into journalism? I said, if you want to be a writer, you need to major in English. If you want to be a reporter, then you add journalism. Now, if you want to minor in journalism to go to the theme, because you might have to have a job, because most writers starve for a long time. That's why I have a full-time job. But as an educator in filmmaking, what would you tell a high school grad who's interested in getting into the industry as maybe a screenwriter, producer, director, whatever? What guidance would you give them as far as pursuing an education, going to college?
Well, number one, I've been head of a department at City University of New York, which is 210,000 people, and another department at Berkeley, which is a gigantic university.
Right.
And so I'm going to just discount all of that right now, because my friends who are heads of studios, like the man who came and spoke last week for my class, say, we don't want somebody who's taken a course in filmmaking someplace. We don't want somebody because in my studio, when we did animation, we did it different than, I'm just using animation as an example, differently than Disney, differently than Warner Brothers, different than MGM. They all have their own styles, different than Pixar, and they want to train the person in those styles. So if you talk to the executives, they prefer people who've got a broad liberal arts audience training, and English is a great way to start. History is a great way, who then they can teach them the Disney method or the Warner Brothers method.
Okay.
You know, if you look at Space Jam, it's completely different than Disney movies, Lion King, etc., in the whole animation and the way they approach it. Now, they're both good. You know, we like them both. But the difference is they have a completely different sense and sensibility. And you don't get that when you go to school. Usually, actually, when you go to film school, you get somebody who didn't make it in the film industry or didn't even try. So it's a tough thing. So my recommendation, get a strong liberal arts education, learn all you can. And if you can, you know, because you can't get that anymore in a major university in America, go to a Christian college because you can get it there.
That is great.
I was head of a department at secular university, so I
Right.
just discounted my whole career.
But you know, that's great advice, because most counselors don't know that, career counselors don't know that, college counselors don't know that. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I will share that because I know there's a few kids who are interested in that. They go into drama in high school, and they kind of get the bug for it, and they want to go into that. And then that's why I tell writers, you know, if you want to be a writer, you need to learn English. And if you want to learn English, then you need to get a degree in English, because you're going to study lit and grammar and all that other stuff that makes up good writers. So that makes perfect sense to me.
Well, I love one of the previous comments that you made. A friend of mine, Sonny Goldstein, just a great guy who was head of production at Paramount Pictures. Somebody would come into him looking for a job, and he said, "What do you do?" "I'm a writer." He'd say, "You're not a writer. You haven't written anything since you've been sitting here. You're a waiter. You work as a waiter. You're not a writer." Or the guy would say, "I'm a producer." "Producer? You haven't even produced a ham sandwich for me. What are you talking about?" "And a director? You can't even direct my secretary to get the ham sandwich." And these guys would just wilt.
Sure.
But he was right. Writers write.
Mm-hmm.
Directors direct. My father, you know, was in the industry from 1926 to 1984. And he said, all I can do is act. Now, he had graduated top of his class at Dartmouth. He had worked for Curtiss Flying Service, test piloting planes and doing all of that. And they went bankrupt. Worked for a bank. They went bankrupt. He could have done anything. But as far as he was concerned, and I show a little clip in my class from Steve Jobs. He says, there are a lot of people who are talented out there, but the only people who succeed are the people who are convinced this is the only thing they can do, and they're driven to do it, and they will not give up. He said, I'm not any more talented than anybody else. Of course, Steve Jobs is no longer with us.
Right.
But the interesting thing is you've got to be convinced I can't do anything else but be a writer, director, filmmaker, whatever it is. That's me.
I mean,
In other words, be a little bit myopic.
That's right. Be completely myopic.
As you know, I just watched the Hemingway 3-part series that PBS put out, and that was him. He was a writer, and he finally he had to get a job as a journalist, but he finally got convinced. He said, "You know what? I'm a writer, and that's all I'm going to do." And that's how he became such a great writer, probably the greatest writer of the 20th century. Some would argue. Well, Dr. Baehr, we were getting to the end of the interview. I just wanted to thank you for, and we'll be sure to tell everybody, because that GK and I were talking. He said, "Hey, I really want to get some feedback. And since you've already done the work for us, we're going to send them to your website. And I'll actually just put the link so they can just click on it and they'll go right to your wonderful list. And I'm going to look at them too, because GK is a film buff. He's always recommending films for me to go watch. And so I agree. I think this is a time where we need to rediscover the beauty of the American film industry, because there's so much great art and talent that's already been done that none of it has.
Dave, let me interrupt you there. And Ted, I want to have a teaser for the next time we have you on.
I'm ready.
I was a music critic for years, 21 years with the Press of Atlantic City, freelance with Billboard, Christian Science Monitor, all kinds of people. Interviewed a lot of musicians. And I really believe that one of the underrated aspects of filmmaking is editing. And another thing I believe is underrated is a really good film score. So the next time we're together, here's my teaser, my cliffhanger. I'd like to discuss some of the movies you feel where the music truly made a huge difference. I'm just going to tease everybody and say, for me, it would be The Third Man. It made a big difference in the way you saw the film. But next time we see you, Ted, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about soundtracks.
We'll do it. Have a great day.
Thanks, Ted.
Thank you.
See you later, sir. God bless. As always, he is so informative. Just a phenomenal life he's had.
His father must have been one heck of a guy.
Oh, my goodness. Well, just look at Ted's beginning. I went and watched the last interview. And if you haven't seen the first interview of Dr. Baehr, you can go to YouTube. You can go to and watch the interview, because he's such a delightful man. He just has this wonderful spirit about him that you can listen to it. If, of course, with the podcast, do both. Listen to the podcast as you're driving to work, and then say, I really want to go watch that, and go to YouTube or Rumble and check out the video, the interview we do with him, because he comes from not just his father, a phenomenal career, but he's had an amazing life. As he said, being a left-wing nut, coming to Christ late in life, and doing just tremendous.
You want to know something, Dave? You just brought up a very good point. I think most people who become adults in the room at some point get to, as Yogi Berra would say, when you come to the fork in the road, take it. And the fact of the matter is, I started out as a teenager campaigning for Goldwater in a heavily Democratic part of New Jersey. But in college, I did the usual liberal thing. I became basically your typical collegiate liberal, and then I reconnected with conservative thought and actions once I was back in the real world, so to speak. And I know you were a bit of a character in your California days, and I think one of the things that can make almost any human being, almost any man or any woman who has done anything in life is, number one, I'm serious when I say this, even though it sounds flip. I think at some point in your life, before the age of 21, you should have done something really stupid. I don't mean murder or arson or anything like that, but something that you go, oh man, how did I ever, what was I thinking? Yeah. How many people in a phone booth, that kind of thing. And I think an awful lot of people that I respect have gone through some form of significant change in their life, whether it's religious, philosophical, whatever we're talking about, career. I never thought that I'd wind up being a writer, which I was for a good deal of my life as a music critic.
Right.
That came from the fact I was a musician. I was married. We had a child, and my wife said to me, after seeing a sign in a local store, writers wanted for a new publication. And Diane said to me, Greg, with your background in music as a musician and all, you'd probably really be a good critic. And from that, I started a writing career. It was because of what my, God bless her, late wife said. simply because she saw a sign in front of the local newspaper stand for all intents and purposes. And from there, 21 years with Atlantic City Press, Christian Science Monitor, when Ted was talking about qualifications for being whatever in a movie business, the first editor I had at the Christian Science Monitor, I did a few freelance pieces for them. He said to me, "Where did you get your degree in journalism?"
Mm,
I said, "I don't have a degree in journalism." About my background. And you know what he said to me? I'm paraphrasing, but it's darn close. "That's probably why you're a good writer,
exactly.
because no one suppressed your creativity. You are somewhat, the word unique and somewhat don't really make sense, but somewhat one of a kind."
No,
And he was kind of right, come to think of it.
absolutely, because
His second
journalism
editor was horrible. She was a major, the second editor I had at that paper made me leave.
journalism stifles your creativity. It throws you into a mold. It gives you these false aspirations of changing the world, and this is why these liberals go and do. This is how they justify what they do at the New York Times and the Atlantic and
They're
all.
social workers with typewriters.
I think that's a great way to describe them. However, for me, and I like what Ted said, I tell people as a writing coach, you write because you're a writer, okay? And a writer writes.
My brother was a drummer and producer.
Yeah, and that's what you do. So you got to learn how to get your crap at. I tell you, Ernest Hemingway was in many ways a scumbag of a man. But if you want to study his life as a writer, I highly recommend you go to Amazon Prime for like $15, $16. It's way cheaper than what NPR is charging. You can buy the 3-part series. If you're anybody listening to this or watching, if you're an aspiring writer, you need to go watch that, because he was meticulous in the way he wrote, because he was a writer. He had to do, and he said he didn't care about the critics, but he did, because he knew what role they could play in his success. But he was so obsessed, and like you said, he became myopic in what he was doing.
Well, you have to do that. And the funny thing is, pardon me for interjecting on this, but there was a time in my life where I was juggling the job I had to do, 9 to 5, running a record store. Okay. At night, I would go to Atlantic City, New York, or Philly to review a show. Back in those days, I had to phone in a review to someone who was taking it down in shorthand, sort of, or like a court reporter at the other end.
Yeah.
Then I'd have to be back in the store at 9 o'clock in the morning to open it up at 10. And I was dealing with being a father, being a writer, being 9 to 5, and trying to juggle all those things. And for a while, I did it pretty well. And there was always that conflict. But the one thing I've learned personally in my life, and my daughter knows the story very, very well. There was a time in my life where I literally was at a part of my life where was, do you remain a good father and do your best to have a relationship with your girl, your daughter, or do you put this particular job first, which would mean sacrificing because of distance and other things? I made the decision, I'm going to be a father to the best of my ability. I'm not saying I was a great father, but I know I tried and I know I love my daughter. That decision, making a personal judgment over career, because guess what? A job can be replaced.
Mm-hmm.
Child cannot be replaced.
That's right. Well, to go back to our comment, I'm going to close with this. If you're young, don't be afraid to be somewhat liberal. I'm going to quote Winston Churchill. He said, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative when you're 40, you have no head. So go ahead but be careful. I was telling my Sunday school classes yesterday or Sunday, because I have been, with what's going on the last couple of weeks, I've really been struggling. My daughters have, my wife, with the anniversary of Eddie's death coming up on the 19th. But you have to be careful, because your emotions can make you not see reality clearly. And so, our moms told us to count to 10 for a reason. But don't get so stiff and so rigid and conservative that you lose your heart and you lose your ability to care for people, because it's real easy to get in that manner. Don't become a Scrooge.
Well, it's sort of like I'm painting with a very broad brush, but with men and women, it seems like men approach things like mathematics. They approach things from a mathematical point of view, and I think women approach things from an artist's point of view.
Yeah.
I think it's a very broad brush, but that's why I think we make good pairs, because I think we bring something. I call it the us factor. When a man and a woman really love each other and they matter to each other, it's not just him and her. It's what I call the us. They create the us, which is the
Yeah.
third party,
Yeah.
which is totally different and will never be the same if you're with somebody else down the road. That's a different us.
Yeah.
And I think when you got it right, you've created an us. And that's what's been missing in my life now for a number of years.
All right. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed the show. Dr. Baehr is always such a great guest and so gracious with his time. And I hope you enjoyed it. We will link to his website so you can go find those great classic comedies. Be sure you go to our website, mindingthemedia.com. You can subscribe to YouTube, Rumble, Stitcher, iTunes, and iHeartRadio now. We're on iHeartRadio, so we're real happy about that. Hey, please spread the word. Help us stay really highly ranked. The more subscribers we get, the more comments we get, and likes and stuff and downloads we get, that will increase our ranking. And we're trying to grow our audience. I think we're doing some good stuff here, if I may be as say that with as much as humility as possible. I think we're doing some good shows. I know we have a guest coming up here shortly that actually it's a mom and a son that's going to be phenomenal. And she listened to a couple of our shows and she's already a big fan. So be looking for that. That will be coming out next Monday. And then we're also going to be having Bill Federer coming on. And we're going to do a Constitution Day show. We'll probably release it. We're going to record him before that. We'll probably release it on Friday, the 17th, around that time, maybe the 16th, so that you can have it. Bill's going to tell us why the Constitution matters, how we got to where we were to get the Constitution and what we've done since then. So it's going to be a great show, as always, with Bill Federer. But until then, folks, please remember, share the word. Let your friends, your relatives, your associates, and neighbors know. And we'll see you next time. GK's Ride has come, and take care. Thanks.